Welcome back to the channel, everybody. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Aaron Ridley. I'm a filmmaker, photographer, adventurer, overlander, and just general outdoor enthusiast, and I just like doing things. So today I figured we might make a video on the basics of cinematic filmmaking. So I get a lot of compliments from people saying how great my videos look, and I figured it's finally time I make a video explaining how I get such great cinematic looking videos and footage off of my camera. Getting a cinematic look to your footage is easier said than done. It's easier to pick up a camera, point it in a direction, set it to auto exposure, and just start filming. But when you bring it into editing, you're just kind of stuck with whatever it is you got. So if you're looking to up your game and you really want to try and get that cinematic look, you really want to try and put a little more effort into getting your camera settings right. Getting a cinematic look isn't actually going to happen by just making one single change to your filmmaking style. Rather, it's the culmination of making a bunch of little changes that all work together. So as you guys know, I'm shooting on an EOS R6, so most of the settings I'm going to be going over are going to be aimed towards optimizing that camera to capture the best picture it can. But you can still take this information and translate it to whatever camera you're shooting on. So to get started, I never shoot with auto exposure. I know it's easy, there's not much effort you have to put into it, but you just don't get that cinematic looking footage. Instead, I like to use manual camera settings, and that is why my footage looks like what it does. Having full control of your camera settings makes an absolutely huge impact on what your final image looks like off the camera. So to get started, let's talk about frame rate. So for all of my videos, I like them to be viewed at 24 frames per second. So for most times, that means I'm going to be shooting at that frame rate. 24 frames per second has become the de facto standard in cinema. For the most part, some directors have tried deviating from that and shooting at their own weird frame rate, but those have just been passing fads. 24 frames per second seems to withstand the test of time itself. When it comes to delivering a cinematic film, 24 frames per second seems to be the tried and true frame rate to deliver your film in. However, when it comes to actually filming, I like to shoot in a variety of different frame rates, and that depends on what effect I want to do. So for the most part, everything is 24 frames per second, unless I'm trying to do some type of slow motion effect. Typically, when I'm trying to do that, I will shoot at 60 or maybe 120 frames per second. But when I bring that footage into the editing timeline, I'm always going to slow it down to 24 frames per second. When it comes to 30 frames per second, I will typically avoid that frame rate because it delivers kind of a soap opera type of look, and I just don't really like it. So once you have your frame rate selected for your project, it's time to start looking at your shutter speed. To get the most cinematic looking motion blur in my footage, I will typically adjust my shutter speed to be twice my frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you will want to have your shutter speed set to 1/48th of a second. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you'll want it set to 120th of a second. Whatever your frame rate is, keeping your shutter speed at twice that number is always going to keep your motion smooth and natural. Keep in mind that when you're shooting in high shutter speeds with high frame rates, you're also reducing the exposure of your footage. The next setting I'm going to be adjusting on my camera is the f-stop. Most of my lenses that I roll with can shoot at a wide f-stop of f1.4. Full frame zoom lenses can't really do this, which is why I actually shoot with primes. This lets in lots of light and creates a very cinematic depth of field, so there's going to be a lot of blur in the foreground and the background, but keeping your subject in focus. And this is an interesting tool to use if you're trying to draw attention to a certain area of your image. It's easy to get carried away and always shoot with a wide open aperture because you always get that super amazing depth of field, really narrow focus area, super deep blurs in the background and the foreground, and it just looks super cinematic. But there's always cases where that won't always work to your favor. For instance, if you're trying to capture a landscape, you typically want to have as much as you can in focus, both in the foreground, background, and in your subject. Having a super shallow depth of field won't really complement a scene like that. And the same kind of goes for wide angle shots as well. In times like that, you'll want to shoot with something like an f16 or an f22, where your f-stop is really clamped down and letting in less light. And the less light you let in, the darker your image will be. So keep in mind that with a higher f-stop, your image will actually be underexposed. So with your frame rate, your shutter speed, and your aperture selected, you'll notice at this point that all of these are affecting your exposure. And while they may affect it, you typically don't want to be adjusting them to compensate for it. If you didn't give a care in the world for what type of shot you're trying to capture, typically you would adjust these in order to create the ideal exposure for your shot. In fact, that is actually how your auto exposure works for you. But the important thing to note here is changing these settings is what actually affects the look of your image. So if we're really trying to capture a cinematic looking image, we really don't want to be adjusting any of these 3 settings. But that still leaves us with a problem of adjusting our exposure. And that leaves 3 more ways we could do this. Method number 1, we can adjust our ISO. Now typically that will work if your scene is underexposed and dark. You can use that to boost the brightness of your image up. But typically with the settings set to what I recommend, your image is probably going to be overexposed. Alternatively, method number 2, you can adjust the lighting. If you're in a controlled lighting environment, you can turn the lighting down. But if you guys are anything like me and you shoot outdoors, you really don't get a lot of say in what nature's lighting is. And this basically leaves method number 3. And this is my preferred method, is to use a variable ND filter. Having an ND filter allows us to just simply rotate the filter to adjust for the brightness of the image. Whether it's too dark or too bright, you just rotate it in the direction you need and you can set the exposure accordingly. But if you're shooting at, say, night or in a dark environment, you'll find that your footage is underexposed and an ND filter is going to hurt you more than it helps you. So you'll probably want to ditch it and you'll need to be adjusting your exposure with your ISO. In times past, ISO referred to the sensitivity of the film itself of film cameras, but in this modern day and age where we have digital image sensors, it actually refers to the signal to noise ratio that the image sensor sees when it's actually shooting. A low ISO of, say, 100 will keep your image pretty dark, and as you start increasing that number, you'll notice your image gets brighter and brighter. But as you brighten it, you'll notice that you're also introducing a lot of noise and distortion into your footage. Most modern cameras can actually accommodate for that. Typically you can go up as high as 3200 or even 6400 ISO, and your camera can handle that just fine. But generally if you go past that, you'll start noticing a lot more distortion going into it. While ISO can be a very useful tool in adjusting your exposure, you may not actually want to adjust it all that much because your camera actually has what's called a native ISO that it likes to film with. And the native ISO basically refers to a certain ISO number where it will capture the widest dynamic range possible to capture the most amount of colors it can see. Of course, this is entirely dependent on the scene that you're shooting, so if you don't exactly have a wide dynamic range of light to capture, you don't really have to worry about that a whole lot. But where this really impacts me is that I like to film in log, and more specifically, I like to shoot in C-Log 3. And the native ISO for C-Log 3 is 800, which means I get a really, really bright picture. And it's not really fun. It's basically mandatory that I either have to bring down the exposure through all the other camera settings we just went over, or I have to use an ND filter. And I much prefer to have a variable ND filter so I don't have to affect those camera settings that we just mentioned, because having those settings set to where they are is what keeps our image looking really nice. So when it comes to scenes that I shoot that are really, really dark, or if I'm indoors or if it's night, I will typically ditch the ND filter and then I will start boosting my ISO. I'm not afraid to go higher because my Canon EOS R6 is actually capable of handling that, but going lower really reduces the amount of dynamic range I can work with in C-Log 3. So there you guys have it. Those are the camera settings I like to use on my EOS R6. I like to film with all these settings. You can easily translate this information to whatever camera it is you're filming on and use it. While there's a lot of camera settings to freak out about and think this is too hard, I try to still keep things as simple as possible, and I really just use a variable ND filter to adjust for my exposure. Once I have all these camera settings set to what I want, my variable ND filter is all I will generally use in order to correct my exposure. Having one allows me to have the complexity of having manual camera settings, as well as having the simplicity to just easily adjust exposure by rolling the filter back and forth, whether I need the scene to be darker or lighter depending on what it is I film. This basically makes a complex method simple and allows for a minimal time of setup between shot to shot. Something to note on the side is that this is just a method I've developed for myself over the years for filmmaking. This is just something that works for me and allows me to capture very cinematic looking footage. So that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed this behind the scenes look at how to get cinematic footage. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask, and I will be more than happy to answer the best of my ability. And I will see you guys in the next video.